Hi everyone, welcome to Backroom Whispering Productions, The Book Table. Today's special Valentine Day episode is about the juicy stuff, sex and sexuality in fantasy literature. We'll discuss how sex is handled in this genre, as well as our own personal opinions and what we'd like to see more or less of. Just as a warning, this is an adult topic, and we do occasionally use profanity at the book table, so keep that in mind. And this episode in particular is for mature audiences as well. I'm Steven. I'll be moderating for the first time today, in fact, and I'm joined by a number of fine people who can introduce themselves now.
Hi everyone, I'm Dorothy. You've heard me on a couple other book table episodes in the past. I'm especially excited to discuss this topic because one of my favorite YA fantasy series actually introduced sex and birth control, and one of the first things that I ever read that introduced those topics. So I'm really interested and really excited to hear everyone else's opinions.
Hi, I am Rebecca. I should be a familiar voice at this point on the book table. I'm excited about this topic because I'll be real, I prefer to read books that have sex or at least mention the fact that sex exists in them. And I had never really thought about that, especially in relation to the fantasy genre. So I'm super excited to talk about this.
Hello, everybody. I'm Madeleine. Like Rebecca and most of the other people, I've been on here several times. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, I think, because I come at it from a different perspective in that I'm asexual, and honestly, sex is sort of like, it's so weirdly not important to me when I read a fantasy. I'm usually one of those people who kind of prefers it in kind of romance to not be in there. So I always find it interesting when it's brought up and how it can be utilized within a narrative. So I'm really excited to have this discussion.
Hi guys, I'm Akhi. I've been here quite a few times as well. And I'm coming from a perspective that's pretty neutral on this. It doesn't matter to me if there is sex or there isn't sex in a book, as long as it fits in the plot and it's like tastefully done. And at the same time, I can deal with a book that has a lot of sex if it's necessary, or I don't mind if there's no sex at all if it's also necessary. But it should make sense and like come across as natural.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I'm a first-time contributor to this cast. I'm interested in this topic. I remember actually the very first time I ever ran into sex in a book was in a young adult sci-fi.
Hi, I'm Dave. I've been on this a few times. Maybe you've heard me in the past. I believe I can relate to this topic less than a few of the other people here, and I think it will be interesting to come from an outside perspective where most of the books I've read don't have too much sex featured in them, and I think that's actually an interesting way to go with fantasy stories.
Now that everyone's introduced, there are a lot of different ways that you can approach a discussion like this. So we've decided to divide the discussion of different works into a few different topics based on the treatment of sex in the corresponding work. Sex-free works, sex-positive, sex-negative, and more like gratuitous sex works and more boundary-pushing works. There are a lot of different options here, so we can probably just start from the very beginning on different sex-free works. I can put the question to the table here. What works can you think of that really epitomize this type of perspective that either do not feature sex at all or even don't even allude to it?
I would like to start this talk off with Harry Potter. I think that this falls pretty solidly under the sex-free category because even though these are books about teenagers, and we all know in the real world teenagers do get into some shenanigans, Harry's interested in girls, there are people kissing girls, but it's never a plot point that anyone has sex with anyone. There are babies, but the babies are made largely off-scene, off-camera. Whatever.
As if by magic.
Yeah, it's almost magical. So I think Harry Potter stands as a strong example of a fantasy series that it features humans. They have human emotions. They do human things. Like, they do develop crushes on each other. They sometimes kiss each other, but they just never go there as far as the next level.
I have to disagree with Dorothy. I do think Harry Potter is probably, I would classify it as sex positive personally because, like, we know, like, people are having sex off screen and they're not being condemned for it, but it's not shying away from showing people, like, get into relationships, like, making out and groping, and it doesn't take a leap of imagination to know that after they're making out and groping in the books, like 2 hours later, they're probably having sex with each other. So I don't think it's completely like sex free. Something that I would consider to be totally sex free is like the Lord of the Rings, because there's like absolutely no indication that anyone is like sexually interested in each other beyond like the romance between characters. But there's never like, oh, and Aragorn met Arwen and they began holding hands and they began dating, and like then imagine 2 hours later they're having sex. Like, it's a completely asexual book. And like, even if you're like an orc who's like really evil and you're like plundering and whatever, you're still not raping. You're just like, oh, we're plundering and murdering. So it's like there's no sex whatsoever.
I sort of understand what you're saying. Like, Tolkien definitely, The Lord of the Rings, super sex-free. I would consider that. But I think that you can imagine, like, Arwen and Aragorn or Éowyn and Faramir going off and having sex just as easily as you could, like, Ron and Lavender. It's never, I think the point is it's never explicitly mentioned or, like, treated as a subject at all in the Harry Potter series.
I would agree with that. I actually think, if anything, those books would mostly imply that these people are not actually having sex at the moment, or like at the time, because people make a big enough deal about kissing or holding hands or any of that kind of stuff that it sounds like, you know, getting to the next level would actually be a topic of discussion, and since it's not, it doesn't sound like it's actually involved.
It's also the fact of where they'd have to go in the castle to do that. Like, they make a point of saying boys cannot get into any of the girls' dormitories. And if girls were going into the boys' dormitories, there's enough talk in each of these common rooms that we would have heard about it in all of the gossip and other conversation that often gets brought up in Harry Potter. Because we're constantly hearing snippets of little side conversations that are happening, but that is never brought up. And that sounds like something that would probably get mentioned, given how much the students of Hogwarts clearly like to gossip.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, the Vila. I mean, the Vila are pretty, I don't want to say sexual creatures. They're pretty seductive creatures. They make guys go crazy and try to prove that they're awesome so that the Vila will look at them. But they still don't talk about, like, going into the broom closet with a Vila. It's just, hey, they're there. They're seductive. Guys are silly.
I remember what I was going to say. I would like to kind of disagree with myself a little bit here. The implication isn't necessarily that nobody is having sex. I would more say that it isn't important to the book. It isn't important to the plot. The main characters probably aren't. And outside of that, nobody is really giving it much of a big deal. So you can't just, I wouldn't necessarily say that nobody in Hogwarts is sneaking off and doing their own thing. But when it comes to whether it relates to the book itself, I would definitely classify it still as an asexual book.
And I think I can pop in to add on to what Dave just said. As for the purposes of this discussion, I think qualifying sex-free as books that really don't mention or talk about sex is probably the best way to classify it going forward. As Akhi said, you can certainly imagine sex happening in a number of these works, but the works simply don't talk about it. I think the works that explicitly reject that possibility probably better belong in the sex negative category, which we'll be treating upon later in the podcast.
Can we also note that Harry Potter, as much as young adults enjoy it, is also written for, adolescents. I mean, a much younger population too.
But there's also murder and torture and racism and, I don't think people would necessarily be giving their 8-year-old the whole series. Maybe the first 2, but especially near the end of the series, it gets pretty, I'm not going to say adult, but there's torture. Kids getting tortured.
It's all like graphic though. It's like appropriate for teenagers, and I think the only reason there's not explicit sex in Harry Potter is because it's written for teenagers. But it's quite obvious to me, at least, that by book 7, like Harry and Ginny, how do you pronounce that, are having sex.
See, I never thought that was obvious at all.
Okay, I'm sorry. Where do you get that from, though? Like, Harry and Ginny are not even, like, physically or romantically together in book 7 until the very, very, very end, when suddenly they have children.
Right.
So I'm just curious why you say they're clearly having
Because
sex.
Harry was living with her, and at the beginning of the book, like
But they weren't in the same room.
Yeah, Harry was in
Ron
Ron
they
would
were
have
like
mentioned
making out and like doing their own thing together. It's not that conceptually hard to like imagine that they were also having sex.
It's not conceptually hard to imagine, but it's certainly not mentioned in the book, and it would actually be you'd have to kind of do some brain gymnastics to figure it out, because every time you see them being physically involved with each other, like when they kiss on the morning of the wedding or whatever, someone else witnesses it. So they're clearly not alone and have no privacy. So I just disagree that it's clear that they're having sex. I mean, I could say, yeah, they're young teenagers, they're into each other, maybe they are, but I don't think the book suggests that in any way.
Yeah, it seems like privacy at the Weasley house would be pretty hard to come by. Everyone's sharing a bedroom with like 3 other people and a ghoul.
I think more the point is that it's not either implied or like mentioned that they're not. It's more that it's just not a topic. And I think that's what we were talking about as sex-free. The fact that it really isn't a topic, whether you could do the mental gymnastics to imply to yourself that they are or are not, depending on what's going on, doesn't matter, because it has no grounds within the story. There's no mention of it at all from either side.
Okay, do we want to have any additional comments? I think everyone has spoken on the topic of sex-free works. Should we move to the sex-positive, or...?
Oh, I was just going to say the only thing I wanted to add was I think you had said, Akhi, that that sex is never really mentioned in YA literature, and I do just want to disagree with that as someone who has read a lot of YA literature and a lot of YA fantasy. Sex is definitely written as a part of it, and sometimes fairly explicit sex. So I think it's very dangerous to say that like explicit sex or very much mentioned sex is not a part of YA, because it's, by this point, it's become a major part of YA lit. When you look at the Harry Potter series, which sort of takes a shift in book 4 towards more of a YA style novel at times, it's interesting that it is relatively sex-free.
Yeah, if it weren't for all the magic and stuff, it would probably be approved by conservative groups.
Yeah, I agree with you. I didn't mean to imply that like all YA was like sex free or anything. I think I just meant in this particular case, because she knew her audience was big and growing and global and worldwide, and they were making movies out of it and whatever. She decided to probably make it as palatable to as many people as possible.
Well, I'm going to argue, and I don't know if this has any grounds in anything at all, but a discussion that we have had in our household on multiple occasions is about how bad she is at even writing the romance. So, like, the relationships between any of the characters, except the already established ones, like Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, are awesome, obviously. Mm-hmm. But especially the teenagers, it's very awkward, I think, to read, and it doesn't often feel very natural. So I think it would have been... Probably she wasn't super comfortable writing it, and I think she probably would have been even less comfortable writing anything beyond the basic, oh my god, I kissed her and the monster rose in my guts and I felt great. Like, I don't know. It was awkward.
Right, I agree. I actually think that obviously the strongest relationships were friendship relationships. And if she had been a comfortable author when it came to writing romantic aspects of the book, she could have taken those further and it would not have been nearly as awkward. But when it comes to Harry with Ginny, Harry with Cho, Ron and Hermione, who literally have zero chemistry, and it's kind of implied off screen that they like each other, most of the time it's fairly awkward and really doesn't end up playing too much into anything in the book anyway.
I kind of give her a pass on that because teen relationships are awkward. I mean, we all had that crush on, well, many of us might have perhaps had that crush on someone just because of, like, one thing about them. Like, they play a musical instrument, but they're so great, but I don't agree with them on anything about anything else, but I kind of still want to sit next to them at lunch. You know, like, there's something awkward about teen relationships. Like, especially young teen relationships.
I think that's definitely true. But my criticism isn't that the relationships themselves were necessarily like awkward in a like believable way. It's more that the writing itself didn't feel, it felt forced, as though she felt like she needed to, because they were teenagers, have some sort of romance involved, but she didn't really know how to do it.
So we can move on to the second category that we had predefined, sex-positive works. Works where sex is mentioned, is discussed, characters are taught about it, and they have the ability to consent if they would like or not like to have sex themselves. Are there any works that we would like to discuss in this topic? I know we have a number currently on the list.
Okay, so I'll jump right in because I'm particularly excited about this, and I'm going to try not to take up too much time on this podcast because I will also have a follow-up blog post on the Backroom Whispering blog about this topic. But I had mentioned at the very beginning a young adult series that discussed birth control, and it was really eye-opening. This series is The Song of the Lioness by Tamora Pierce. And Tamora Pierce writes a lot of YA fantasy. She writes strong female characters, she writes kids with magic and swords, and it's really fantastic. You should check her out if you haven't read her. But in this series, The Song of the Lioness, this girl who is disguised as a boy to train as a knight, essentially, starts her period and freaks out. And she goes to a healer, and the healer says, okay, this is your period, this is how you deal with it. By the way, this is what sex is. Here's a charm to prevent you from getting pregnant. And this girl is 11 or 12. She's training to be a knight. She's not, like, a prostitute. She's not, someone whose sex is in the job description or anything like that. It's just that this is a fact of life. This is something happening to your body. You have this option to use this charm to prevent getting in trouble. And that was kind of, my head exploded when I read that, because this character, she's not interested in anyone. She's not, oh my god, I love that boy. She's just, I have become a mature adult, and here's something I need to know about my mature adult body. And it's just marvelous. So for me, that's an example of sex positivity. It's not, hey, go have sex all the time. It's, this is your body, this is what it's capable of. Here's the information that you need.
I love that moment in that book, too. I recently listened to the Song of the Lioness Quartet just this past year, and that was something when I was listening to the audiobook, when that conversation started happening, I actually had to pause the audiobook and just sit there and go, whoa, this conversation is actually happening. And I'd been under the impression that those books were actually meant for a younger audience, because I worked in a Barnes & Noble, and we would actually shelve them in the children's section. Not in the young adult or teen section, which is why I was so surprised that conversation started happening. But then I was just so excited about it happening, because as much as I am not like really into reading like sex and romance and stuff in my literature, but when it's treated so frankly and so honestly, and in a way that it's like, you need to learn to be safe and like smart with your body because it's your body. You have the right to do with it what you want, but here's some options. That was so exciting for me to read in something that I had thought was directed at a really young audience.
Yeah, I definitely encountered Tamora Pierce when I was 11 or 12. So I was not a teen. I was not interested in boys or girls or whatever. I was just, I want to read this book about this girl who becomes a knight and is awesome. And this was just very casually mentioned as a fact of life. And there's also another mind-blowing moment in another Tamora Pierce book, and then I'm going to shut up about this, where a male character actually takes an herb that makes him sterile because he has been sleeping around and he doesn't want to, I don't know what he says, sow any fields. He doesn't want to leave anyone with a responsibility afterwards. So a boy actually takes the responsibility for birth control. And to me, that's like a huge step. And these books, Song of the Lioness was written in the early 80s, by the way. So this isn't some like crazy new wave feminism. This is just someone who was thinking about the realities of a young girl disguised as a boy to train for a knight. Okay, I'm done. I'm done talking about Tamora Pierce. Next.
We have a person who's not with us, but he brings up a point that I think is pretty good. And I think it makes sense in the context of what Dorothy just said. It's like, these things all like seem really good and nice and whatever, but I think it should also fit with the story and the world. And we shouldn't just have these things that make people feel like, oh, yay, feminism in a book, yay, we're talking about mature things, if like it doesn't make sense in world. Like, it seems like a little contrived to me at times. Like, I haven't read this book, the series, but I know that in the series, obviously genders are not equal because most of the knights are males. Is that correct or no?
Every single one of the knight is a male. She is disguised as a boy to train for a knight.
So if women could have control over their reproduction in this world, then why are they not more equal like men, for example? Like, why are all the knights still like males? Like, the whole thing has to fit together. It kind of seems like some things have just been inserted to make it feel more quote-unquote modern and in touch with, like, the contemporary view on sexuality, etc.
Well, my argument there would be people are always equal in societies in different things and unequal in different things depending on the culture that's involved. I could make a very compelling argument as to why maybe only males would be knights in a certain section of society or, a certain culture. But when it comes to a person's sexuality and a person's right to control their reproduction, I believe that any person can easily have control over that without making it seem unrealistic, especially if there are these magical charms that are involved, if there is a culture of respect between the men and the women, whether they're filling certain roles or not. I actually don't think that it necessarily cancels out the ability to have equality in certain measures.
So I think this is also something that would be more apparent for people who have read the book, because there is a structure with a great mother goddess who takes care of battered women, and it's a patriarchal society. You're like, yeah, the king definitely has more power than the queen, but women also, like, there's a quote, "A woman's body belongs to herself," and that's the end of it. So a woman might not be able to become a knight openly at this point in the timeline, but she is able to choose whether or not she wants to have a baby.
There's also the fact that even things like Game of Thrones, which are wildly patriarchal societies that are set up in that, they talk about things like moon tea and the ability for women to have some sort of contraceptive measures that way. So, I mean, it's clearly happened in fantastical stories where it's a highly patriarchal society.
I mean, it's also historically accurate. Like, as long as there have been people, there has been birth control and abortion and discussions about sex.
Could whoever suggested the Throne of Glass series kind of introduce it maybe to the group?
Oh,
that was
me.
Mad. Yeah.
Yeah, I can do that. So another series that I had thought of is a YA kind of high epic fantasy series. It's called the Throne of Glass series, which, very quick blurb, it's got a female assassin type character and lots of things happen and it's too much for me to explain. But I was going to say that the female protagonist, whose name is Selena Sardothian, is actually very sexually active throughout the series. She takes 3 to 4 like different sexual partners throughout the series, and it's all with different levels of romantic and emotional attachment. For example, there's one character where she just kind of looks at it and goes, yeah, I'm kind of sexually attracted to you, but like you're not going to be ever anything more than that. With others, she looks at as potential romantic partners and on different levels of that. And it's not important to anyone like who she's bringing into her bedroom each night. It's like nobody's business. None of the men, none of the women ever comment on it. They're just sort of like, you do you and we'll do us, which I loved the idea that the sex was not shameful in any way. Nobody judged her for it, and that she could just go off and have a healthy, sexually active life.
Were these sexual encounters integral to the plot development?
At least 3 of the 4 of them kind of were. One happens mostly off screen. It appears in a set of prequels, but it was for the emotional connection to it. The one where there wasn't much of an emotional connection, it just kind of happened and they moved on. The other 2, one of them especially, yes, provided a major plot point going forward into books 3 and 4. And I can't say too much because of spoilers.
And in these sexual encounters, was the dialogue and description, quote, explicit, or just saying they went and had sex and the next morning occurred?
It's kind of more along the lines of explicit for YA without going too far. It's much more focused on the emotion of the characters as opposed to describing like bodily organs. But it's very clear that they are having sex and that is what's going on. There's definitely no way you could read it any other way.
I have a question for the entire group, actually, if anybody wants to jump in. When you guys say you have a sex-positive outlook on a fantasy novel that you're reading, would you say that that novel is balanced in having both sex positive and sex negative elements? Or would you say that most of the time, if something is sex positive, it is purely sex positive, and then if something is sex negative, it's mostly sex negative?
Oh, so actually, thank you for asking that. We did not plan that. Because what I wanted to talk about in this category is whether or not, and I would like your guys' opinions on this, both those of you in the conversation and if people feel the need to comment, on whether a whole body of literature can be considered sex positive if sex is dealt with sort of differently across it and in different situations. And what that means and where that fits into this conversation. And I'm thinking, I'm sorry if not all of you have read all of these, but specifically about Juliet Marlier, who is my favorite author. I'm sorry, shameless. And she has written both YA and adult fantasy novels. And in every single one of her novels, sex is a subject that is brought up as either something that characters want or something that happens. And it, in every instance in the books, is actually dealt with very differently. In one of her first books, the main character is pretty brutally raped at the beginning of the story, and so the idea of sex is like frightening and terrifying to her, even though she's in this world surrounded by, women who are gossiping about how much they enjoy, going to bed with their husbands and other men and whatever. And eventually at the end of the novel, she is open to the idea. And then in other novels, characters actually have sex outside of marriage and sometimes graphically depicted, and it's fine. And in other books, you get the romance sort of thing where it's oh, my body wants him because I love him, and that's what love is. And then in some books, people are nervous about the idea, or they're not sure how they feel about it, but they decide if they trust a person that maybe it'll be okay. And sometimes it's okay outside of marriage, and sometimes only in the context of marriage. And so I don't know kind of how you guys would go about classifying sort of would that be a book by book case on whether something is sex positive, or because sex is there and it's discussed and people are aware of it as a subject and are thinking about it, does that make it sex positive?
So in our definition, which I believe I borrowed from the sex positive movement in general, it's sex ed is the first pillar. So they're taught about sex. And then that they have the ability to choose if they would or would not is the second pillar. So to me, I guess I would almost go by the majority. If, most of the characters are taught and most of the characters have choice, I would say then on a whole, it's positive. Because if you have a realistic world, there's going to be some bad stuff. There's going to be some name calling or something like that. So it's not every single instance of sex is always perfect. It's, a realistic world. So I think it would have to go by the average.
So you think that you can classify a single book that has almost a balance, but some good, some bad, regardless, as either sex positive or sex negative because it is more skewed in one direction?
I think that it would also be degrees of. It would be, this is strongly sex positive because sex ed, consent, experimentation. Or this is mostly sex positive because, there's some sex ed, but not very much consent, not very much. I can't formulate the sentence, guys. I'm sorry. Does anyone know what I'm trying to say?
I actually know exactly what you're trying to say. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, sure. No, I was just, my impression was that you're saying that as with many of these classifications, the question isn't whether something is sex positive or not, but it's a matter of degree, that some different works are extremely sex positive as they do not shy away from a variety of different issues such as reproductive rights or potentially different types of sexual relationships, while others might simply allude to those things and would be sex positive but to a lesser extent.
So
is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. And then the word spectrum came back to my head. On a spectrum, you could say 0 is sex is the devil. If you go to sex, if you have sex, you'll go to hell and burn, and you just never, you slut, don't ever have sex. And then 10 is sex is wonderful. This is birth control. This is consent. This is something that happens as we grow up. You can have things that are a 5 or a 6. It's not just A or B. Of course, it's always easier to talk about the two ends of the spectrum. And our other example was the His Dark Materials series. Did somebody talk about that? Did I zone out, or?
No one spoke about that.
Yeah. So we also had the His Dark Materials series, which we actually discussed on a previous book table, so I won't take up too much time. But basically the conclusion is that it's... Actually, Rebecca, would you like to... Or Mad, you guys like the marzipan scene?
Well, the marzipan scene that was scrubbed clean not quite clean in the US version. But actually, I mean, sort of the premise of His Dark Materials is Pullman's inverse of the story of the fall, particularly from Paradise Lost, in which basically growing up, which involves sexuality, especially in a lot of Christian literature, is a bad thing. And Pullman says no. So the premise of His Dark Materials is that you want to get to that point where you're able to question and think and have sex and be a mature and fully experiencing adult. So that's a huge part of the Amber Spyglasses, that kind of like climactic scene, as it were, which may or may not actually be about sex, because as Pullman says, he didn't actually write sex in there. People have sort of written it in there for him. In retrospect. So, so that's, I think, a really interesting piece of very conscious sex-positive literature. Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add.
It is definitely, I think, a piece of sex-positive literature in the way it deals with coming of age and growing up and experiencing, like, sexual feelings and desires towards somebody else to whom you have a connection. So, yeah, Rebecca pretty much said it all.
Okay. Should we move on then?
I think so.
Yep.
All right. So the next category we're going to talk about is sex-negative literature. Literature that takes a negative view on both sex and people that have it. The implication that sex is a bad thing and characters who do are bad. Obviously, this is something that we can have less positive feelings about, but what are a few different works in this category that we would like to discuss?
So we had one main example under this category, and I actually don't feel very qualified to talk about it, so I'll just introduce it, and hopefully someone else can help me out. That was C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia, basically kicking Susan out of Narnia because she got interested in lipsticks and parties, and I think stockings was the other thing. So an implication that because she was increasingly interested in the opposite sex, that she was no longer worthy of being in Narnia. So can anyone elaborate on that?
My interpretation of what happened to, I don't know what happened to Susan specifically. What happened to Peter when he wasn't able to go back had nothing to do with sexuality either. It had more to do with his growing up and not being, his heart being more in the real world. When it comes to my experience with those works, I think there wasn't supposed to be that implication specifically, that this one thing was keeping her out. I think it was aging. Maybe it's not true with her, but certainly with Peter, it was aging and becoming more comfortable in the real world than in Narnia.
Yeah, my argument to that is just that in the end, everybody but Susan gets to go to the metaphorical heaven, to the Aslan's world. And
see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, sorry, spoilers. That's the end of the series. They basically die, and she doesn't. And she's left behind because she's interested in lipsticks and nylons. And many people have pointed out, including authors like J.K. Rowling, that Susan is now irreligious because she found sex and became an adult and was interested in being kind of a sexual being attractive to other men or to other women, when we never specify which, though knowing Lewis, he probably meant other men. For me, I always found it kind of wildly, uncomfortably kind of sexist. I can understand that it was partially probably a product of the times and of the thinking then, but there's things implied in what happened to Susan that it's because she's become a kind of sexually active, autonomous, adult female.
That's actually fairly disappointing to me because I like her character. I like a few of the characters in that. I feel like plot-wise, it doesn't make sense. Maybe this is going off topic a little bit, but she had grown up before in Narnia. She had grown up, like they had grown into adults, And for them to make that leap that she had to grow up again and that she turned into this frivolous thing, sounds like quite I would agree with you. It's very much implying that, because she turned into this one thing, that it's definitely she's getting a punishment for it.
Yeah, we talked about it fairly at length in a different episode. In our Christmas special on religion and YA literature, we spent a lot of time on what's called the Susan problem.
Akhi, did you have something to say? I thought I
so
had heard you.
When Susan grew up in Narnia back when she was the Queen of Narnia, in I believe the third book, The Horse and His Boy, she did evidence interest in men, and she had suitors come to her and so on. As Madeleine said, we did talk about this before in the previous podcast, but I don't see Susan's choice as something that stems from her finding sexuality versus her becoming a more serious person in C.S. Lewis's eyes.
Is there any evidence from what he said after the books were written that anybody knows about?
The most, as far as I know, that he ever directly said about what happened to Susan is that he said she became a silly, conceited, girl or conceited young woman. It was something very condescending in that he said, but I don't think he ever elaborated beyond that.
I do think that there's a nuance in literature on what you would call sex negative topics. I think this nuance needs to be appreciated because there's definitely a spectrum also in sex negativity between sex is evil, it's the worst thing ever, you'll go to hell, versus there's some value in if you make a choice, whether it's spiritual or non-spiritual, a choice towards chastity or certain types of traditional sexuality, and that shouldn't be condemned either. And there are many, many people who are not judgmental or anything, but they still feel like there's more to life than just thinking or doing things in the sexual realm.
I would actually agree with you. And in a lot of literature, I do feel like, especially young adult literature, there's the excitement aspect involved, where people are really finding themselves, and they want to make the sex itself be positive. I also do think there is a certain value in a person, as we were talking about. Sex positive is all about the ability to make the choice. When it is implied in something that a person who is new to sex, or anybody really, is making the choice to not have sex because sex itself is bad, that's one thing. When the person is instead making the choice to not have sex because they are not ready to have sex, they don't want to have sex with this particular person, etc., that is a very important distinction. And I do think that a book that goes in that direction would actually become a sex-positive book, not a sex-negative book. So if you have a book like, I don't know if this is a great example, Twilight, for instance. They had the main character was very much into the love interest. Bella and Edward, everybody knows this. And
spoilers.
Oh my God! So
I was Team Jacob. What?
Right, but there was a whole attitude behind it where she said, he touched my hand, didn't go any further, and that was good. And I know that there are religious affiliations with this author as well, but I think the way that particularly is handled when it is a personal experience for Bella is the right way to go, and that actually makes it not sex positive, or not sex negative, but sex positive.
But one of the deals in Twilight is that they can't have sex until they're married / she's a vampire, because it will kill her.
Okay, that's different.
Not the most
that's different.
positive.
If we're going to go back to sex negative, I actually have an example that I don't know who else has read this. I know some people have. The Anita Blake series starts out very much, it's kind of interesting. I think it starts out very sex negative. The main character is definitely very much into a bunch of these. She's got sexy guys all around her all the time. There's love interests. There's people that she just looks at and describes them, that sexualizes the hell out of them. But in the first few books, the only people that are having sex are people who are either very damaged or quite evil. The first book actually has an explicit scene with a 1,000-year-old vampire who looks like she is, I think it's either 11 or 12 years old.
Oh yeah, that's fun stuff.
She's absurdly evil. So when it comes to sex in that book, it's not necessarily, they're not saying that all sex is bad necessarily, but they are saying that in this atmosphere, sex is related to very bad things going on. So that would definitely classify that as sex negative. Later on in the series, it actually changes a little bit to where when the main character starts having sex, she eventually ends up having many sexual partners, and it becomes pretty darn over the top, actually, with the amount of sexual partners
But
she
she's
has.
never really okay about it. Like, she's always conflicted. She always feels like she's using people. So this attitude from the first book about, like, it's a negative thing and it's using people, it kind of does follow her.
Well, and also when she starts having sex, I don't think it's right when because there's, like, the book where she has sex with Jean-Claude and then eventually also Richard. But then she gets what is it called?
Description on that.
What is it called? The ardor?
Yeah, so she has this, it's called the ardor.
French word.
Yeah,
but isn't that literally, like, she's like a demon sort of character, and that's like a thing, and so she, in order to, like, basically stay alive, has to have sex, and she resents it for, like, so the books devolve into literally just her going from sexual encounter to sexual encounter to sexual encounter so that she won't be drained of energy. And she hates all of it, and she views it very negatively for the whole series. So it's weird because it develops into an erotica sort of series, but is still, I think, could be considered sex negative in that it's never, like, a good thing that she's having sex.
See, I think there's a few different aspects to that, because there are a few relationships that she's very positive about. One of them is with a character named Nathaniel, who is a good deal younger than her and is kind of this innocent figure, in her mind at least, that she ends up having a big crush on, and, you know, has sex with a bunch of times, has a real relationship with him where they both kind of need each other. And then there's another character named Micah who she really likes, and I think the readers are supposed to really like, who is okay with the fact that she's having sex with all these other men and still supports her. And so this is another instance, I guess, where we could just say that the outcome ends up being more sex negative than sex positive, even though there are sex positive aspects in it. But she definitely does have a general resentment to the situation she's in, I suppose.
So I think you brought up a really interesting point about how in the first books, the creepy underage vampire character, like, all of the stuff that she's into is used to demonstrate just how creepy and squicky, for lack of a better word, her character is. And I think that other authors use this deliciously. And I know that we're going a little bit off from the sex negative, but I think that's okay because we actually don't really have time to go into all of the categories in as much detail as we'd like. But I think George R.R. Martin uses sex in a really magnificently terrifying way to demonstrate how gross and creepy and evil characters are. And I think that that's an interesting and completely different from what we've been talking about thus far, use of sex in a narrative.
I would even go as far as to describe George R.R. Martin's portrayal of sex as exploitative, and to the audience, not to the characters. I actually think there's a certain amount of this is what he thinks people want to read about, and that kind of bothers me personally. There is almost zero positive sex in his world that is supposed to be, from his mind, I'm sure, a very realistic, very detailed type of fantasy world.
Oh, there was the swinging couple from Dorne. We had a category in our original discussion plans. We had a category of boundary pushing sex, and we had talked about some, like, LGBT relationships. And there was, in Game of Thrones, there was a couple that were married and they were happy in their marriage and satisfied in their marriage, but sometimes the husband slept with other dudes and sometimes the wife slept with other ladies. And it's very it's boundary pushing.
Who's this?
Oberyn Martell and
Oberyn.
his...
Oh, they weren't married, though. They were just, like...
Oh, yeah, his mistress.
Yeah.
Paramours.
Paramour is the term they use, yeah.
Okay,
They go to great pains to say that she is a respected figure, more or less, in the court.
So that's also a whole other thing, is that, like, it's a wife type character and she's respected and she's still invited to, well, not really respected, but, you know,
By the Dornish, she's respected.
Yeah, they have to invite her to parties because they know that she's an important part of his life, and, like, his children by her are semi-legitimate, I guess. So it's just this structure that's completely different from the other relationship structures in the series.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting point, though, that they aren't married, and that is made a point of, is that this one relationship that seems... Oh, I'm sorry, that was me. This one relationship that seems to be, I mean, not, like, completely equal, but they have this sort of understanding and mutual relationship with each other and then other people, and it's fine, and she's respected, but they're not married. Like, that's interesting, and I don't know if that's on purpose or not.
Yeah, that's, like, the only other happy couple I can think of, and they're the one that's not married.
And I think the interesting thing is they're also Dornish, so, like, in the eyes of society, they can get away with it. But can you imagine if they were, like, from, I don't know, the Westlands or, like, something else, like, you know, the Lannisters' territories? Like, it wouldn't fly. So it's like, hey, these people are a little, like, weird and exotic, so we'll, like, let it slide. That's, like, the attitude you kind of get in King's Landing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why it probably falls into more of a boundary-pushing work, that the A Song of Ice and Fire series is one that attempts to include a variety of different cultures and outlooks on sex. And in some examples, especially perhaps in the North, in the latter books, you have a lot of, menace associated with a number of characters, especially perhaps Ramsay Snow, and sex is used very much to help emphasize the evil of some of these characters. But also in Dorne, on the south end of the continent, things are quite different. So in that particular work, I think you can have different contexts in this fictional globe-spanning work fall into different categories, which is one of the reasons why I think it probably encompasses multiple ones depending on the part of the book.
You could actually have a whole discussion on just sex in Game of Thrones, because there's also...
Absolutely.
And no, it's not a spoiler. Well, I don't know what's qualified as a spoiler. But there's a certain redhead... and a certain Snow. And that's a consensual, like, informed relationship. And they do some shenanigans with the Lord's kiss and all that.
But not married.
Wait,
again.
Sansa and Jon together? I'm just kidding. Don't worry.
Yes, that's exactly it. And also they're king and queen, and also they have dragons. The end.
Called it!
Best week ever.
So I can't think of the exact quote, but, like, I remember George R. R. Martin, like, once, like, responded to criticism of, like, the gratuitous sex in his books, and he was like, yeah, it might be a little over the top because, like, maybe that's, like, for marketing, but, like, on the whole, like, this is, like, reality, and a lot of people don't realize that, like, the majority of, like, marriages throughout history were, like, arranged marriages, and most people were probably, like, very unhappy with their sex lives until, like, the 20th century. Like, I think that's something, like, we miss a lot, like, because we live in these times, but, like, yeah, I'm sure most people, like, didn't have a concept of, hey, like, I should be having sex for pleasure, and it's going to be a good thing. It's good to know that, because there are a lot of places in the world today that are just not, like, happy.
I think one of the interesting things about that actually is he is obviously trying to emulate this world that is very medieval, encapsulates a lot of different cultures throughout medieval history. But then you also have the concept of marrying for love, which actually wasn't a concept that was even widely used until the Renaissance age. And so the fact that love actually does exist, marrying for love actually does exist as a concept in Game of Thrones muddles the waters a little bit, because you know that this concept exists and is being thrown around, and yet you have all of these horrible things happening, all of these bad people doing such bad things to each other. And I think that muddles the waters a little bit on the argument that it's historically accurate, because in that aspect it's actually not.
But I would disagree and say that just because the majority of people went through arranged marriages, it doesn't mean that love didn't exist. Then many people do fall in love with the people that they are arranged to marry, or just because they have an arranged marriage, they may still take a mistress or something. It's not like love is like contrary to a society that functions in such a way, though.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think historically, I mean, you had sometimes, and actually more often than not, and this actually still happens in our world, not more often than not, but more often than I think we think in the Western world, arranged marriages can be very happy marriages, and people can grow very close and learn to love each other quite a bit. But I think historically speaking, you get sometimes, sure, people liked each other, and a man and a woman met a couple times and decided they were super into each other and they got married. But often, and Akhi, I think you brought this up a little bit, the idea of love and the concept of love was actually taken care of outside of marriage. So this is like, your knights and the ladies, and they would write poetry and fight for ladies, and there was like this idea that they were in love with this particular queen, or lady sounds like such a not great word in our modern context, but that's actually what it was. And that's where like the love was expressed versus in the marriage, even if that never actually came to anything like physically speaking. I mean, it's interesting, and part of it is that we don't actually know, like for the everyday person, what it was like, because most of our historical records, right, are from the ruling class and people who were actually able to like write or talk about or felt like it was worth writing or talking about these people. And when property was involved, arranged marriages were far more likely. We don't know if on the ground people were marrying for love all the time, because we have no idea what was going on.
I'm sorry, really quickly, who is we're talking about the existence of marriage for love in Game of Thrones. Who is that?
Dave.
No, but who married for love?
In Game of Thrones?
Some peasants, right?
In Game of Thrones.
In Game of Thrones, who married for love specifically?
Yeah.
Robb Stark. Robb actually, it depends on the book. It depends on the adaptation.
Well, that turned out really well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course it turned out badly. What I'm saying is that the concept definitely exists and is thrown around.
Yes.
Okay, but my argument would be Sansa, who has the first arranged marriage in the series, very much has this idea about what she wants to happen with her marriage. She wants to marry a prince. She wants him to be handsome. She wants to fall in love with him. She wants them to have a great life together where they're both perfectly happy. And so maybe that concept was thrown around back then. I think that it was from what I've seen and read, it was mostly people knew that they were going to be going into arranged marriages with the expectation that it was for their families and not for themselves. So what I was saying is the fact that this concept of individual happiness in a marriage based on love makes it so that the overall tone of sex in the books seems quite a bit darker.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't get that the first time, and I know that I interrupted Akhi, so did you?
No, I just wanted to... I can't speak for medieval Europe and what people from the classes below the upper classes did, but I definitely know from, like, my experience as someone of, like, Indian origin, like, everyone in India, whether you're, like, upper class or, like, even at the lowest, like, rungs of the ladder, have arranged marriages. So it's not just, like, an elitist thing. It's, like, a thing for everyone.
Right, and I think that was true in medieval Europe as well a lot of the time, because people are looking, whether they're lower class, higher class, whatever, they're still looking for the same thing, and that is social advancement, political advancement, security, any of those things that have more practical uses, I guess, than just marrying for love.
And I think that's why, like, also, like, back then, like, having a mistress wasn't the deal breaker the way it is now, because, like, now when people find each other for themselves, like, having a mistress is, like, considered, like, a betrayal. But, like, then I think it was understood that, hey, this is just an arrangement. So if you want to find love, it's okay to have a mistress on the side. Like, that's totally natural and normal.
And I think that was definitely also on an individual basis. There were always jealousies, always people with jealousies, that kind of thing. But I think you're right to a certain extent when the expectation wasn't that people were going to be falling in love, then absolutely both parties definitely wanted to find that anyway. So I can see what you're saying there. And I hope everybody understands the point I was making specifically about Game of Thrones.
All right, so since we are running a little short in time, I think we can take a step towards our final question, which is there a difference between how sex is treated in YA fantasy as opposed to adult fantasy? We've discussed works in both categories, such as the A Song of Ice and Fire series on the adult category, but in the YA category, many other works such as the His Dark Materials books or Harry Potter. Do all of you think that there is a difference fundamentally between how sex is depicted in these two different genres in general, or do you think that is more a function of individual works rather than any overarching themes?
So my feeling would be that the difference is in language, in like the exact terms and how explicit things get. Because if you just go through and count instances of sex, I think that there are some YA books that would rival some adult books. But if you count instances of some slightly more vulgar terminology or slightly more detailed, well, the juicy bits, let's just say, I think those would be a lot more frequent in adult than in YA.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. There's definitely, it's not that YA ever shies away from sex. It's definitely brought up, and I happen to read quite a lot of YA all the time, and it is a frequent appearance in especially fantasy YA, but it does have to do with the choice of language, especially about body parts and like specifics. So, and I do think sometimes it is also on a book by book basis. Like if you're talking about YA in general, then yes, it has to do with the language and the descriptive and the very particular words that are chosen to describe very particular acts and things that are happening. But on a book by book basis, some books can be way more sexually charged and erotic, or maybe even close to explicit than others. I think it does sort of depend, if that answer makes any sense.
I feel like the main difference between, if you're going to talk about young adult versus adult sex, is not the amount of the content or how much influence it has over the work, but the complexity to which it can be dealt with. In a young adult book where you have two people, they go to bed and they feel a certain way about this person or whatever, you can describe all of that, but when you have an adult fantasy that can actually describe specific acts, and maybe go into more darker types of sex, or not necessarily darker, but let's say kinkier, you can actually get a different sense of how a relationship is forming by the way they're actually having sex, which you cannot explore in a young adult novel. So, in one instance, someone might, have a bondage scene of some kind, and that would play into the relationship. The fact that they were doing that specific thing in the sex would play into the relationship more than just the fact that they had sex and they either liked or disliked it or whatever.
I think I agree. I also think that the biggest difference between the way it's handled in YA and adult, so I think in general, I think there's a difference. There are, of course, certain YA books that are outside of the norm and certain adult fantasy books that are outside the norm. But because in YA, the characters are almost always teens, usually when sex is brought up or comes up, it's like a first time thing for the characters. Whereas in adult fantasy, you will more often get characters who are already like experienced, or at least have a different kind of experience of the world and sex as a concept. So it can be dealt with differently versus I have now hit puberty and I'm experiencing liking and wanting to be with another person for the first time. And what is this like? In adult, you can have like older adult characters who aren't necessarily going through that. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. Of course, does that actually play out in a lot? Not necessarily. In a lot of fantasy where sex comes up, it's in a romantic context, which is going to be usually a first time for a lot of characters anyway. But conceptually, I think that would probably be the biggest difference between the two that I can think of.
I mean, to bring this out. I mean, we clearly young adult and adult are targeting two different audiences, and I think it's interesting that we didn't go into the different what defines a genre as young adult or after that, but it's two different audiences.
So if you're interested on the topic of what defines the genre young adult, we actually have an episode of the book table. It was our second episode called What is YA that you can listen to on SoundCloud or iTunes.
Awesome. But Thomas, do you want to, I think I'd be interested if you expand on that a little further. So, because they're towards different audiences, how do you think the difference is then handled?
I think mechanisms is trying to sell a book partially. I mean, we talked a little bit about Twilight, and I think part of what sells that book is, it's a romance book, and there's got to be some sort of sexual tension. And again, I'm not familiar with the exact plot line, but clearly over a number of books, it's developed into some sort of sexual relationship through metamorphosis or marriage or whatever mechanism they use. And then with adult books, let's say, I kind of think of the standalone like murder mystery genre where the two partners just at some point 2/3 throughout the book, author throws in a sex scene just as kind of some extra candy in the book to sell it. So maybe in young adult we kind of would hope that the mechanism used is as character self-exploration and development. Where in an adult book, you can kind of have it stand alone by itself.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, it made me think of, there's a famous quote by Alfred Hitchcock where he says, you have a bomb under the table. It's more exciting for an audience if the bomb doesn't go off than if it does, because you rev up the anticipation. So I think oftentimes in a lot of YA, more time is spent on the revving up towards any sort of sexual encounter or any sex that happens. And as Rebecca mentioned, it is often kind of a first time experience. And then taking on that these are being marketed towards teenagers, it's so much more about the emotion and development of the characters before the sex, and then the sex happens. And maybe that could also be because parents are oftentimes buying these books for their children. So if we say, no, it's not really about the sex, it's about them as people and as characters and as relationships before all of that. But yeah, we might throw it in there. But it is sort of like the Hitchcockian element of it's the bomb maybe not going off. We're not entirely sure. So I guess you could say YA is almost like a little more teasing at times.
I would even argue that authors that are writing the adult or the young adult genre tend to want to use the relationship and the growing and changing of the relationship and really the drama that's inside the relationship, the fights, the falling outs, and the getting back together, that whole thing. They want to keep it intense. And a lot of the time you will see characters not getting together for way longer than seems appropriate, or not just appropriate, but realistic. And I would say that because I think that happens because once you get two people together and they're actually stable, it's harder to keep the interest for that particular relationship going, because it becomes stale, at least in the minds of the author, if not in the readers as well.
I agree with Dave's point, and I also agree that the opposite is also true with a lot of authors, and in a lot of this is not necessarily true of YA nowadays, but I think maybe a couple of decades ago, both YA and fantasy had a lot less relationship and sexual stuff because conversely, people want to get away from the messiness of the relationships in real life. So maybe they read these things where they could escape to and not have to think about the nitty gritty of relationships.
I would also argue, and you guys can feel free to push back on this, but that the audience for fantasy has changed. I think we talked about this a little bit in one of our other episodes, and I hope that we get to talk about it in our Evolution of Fantasy, which will be coming out at the end of this month. But it seems to me that a lot of the classic fantasy was written more towards a male audience, where it was more expected that the people that were going to be reading it were going to be males, partly because of literacy and whatever. Whereas nowadays, readership is skewed more towards females. And obviously, like, the entire romance genre, like, I'm sure there are men out there that read romance, but it's pretty clearly geared towards women as an audience. And I think that romance in general, and that's the same for YA, that romance is seen as something that's appealing to women. And a lot of the sex that comes up in fantasy is in that sort of romantic context. So I wonder, too, if that's part of it, is that the audience has changed. So authors are thinking about the fantasy genre in a different way because they're kind of gearing it towards this sort of perceived and perhaps true idea that people want to be consuming romance and sex within a romantic context.
Okay. Do we have any other comments, or should we try to go to closing remarks? Again, this first time I'm doing the moderating bit, so...
I think that we have a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I know that I'm going to be doing a follow-up blog post specifically discussing Tamora Pierce and how she addresses this topic in her books that, again, written in the 80s, again, addressed at a younger audience, but still just a completely unique viewpoint on this topic.
Yeah, thanks you guys all for talking about this. As Dorothy said earlier, this is a super huge topic and we've barely scratched the surface, but I think we had some good conversations. We brought up a lot of different literature and a lot of different topics, so I hope this was enjoyable for you listeners. And thanks to Thomas for joining us. Thank you, Stephen, for moderating. Thanks, Dave, for sharing this microphone with me. And that was not as awkward as it could have been because we actually were pretty good about sharing it. Yay, us!
We do that pretty well.
But anyway, going back, any listeners, if you, as always, if you have any thoughts or comments or want to contribute to this conversation, especially if you think we should continue to have it and talk about other topics that we didn't bring up that you'd like to hear about, please, please, please interact with us on Twitter, on Facebook, on our website, and let us know what you're thinking about so that we can make sure we get back to you and include you in that conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks for tuning in.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial by going to audibletrial.com/thebooktable. The Book Table is a podcast from Backroom Whispering Productions. Our theme music is by Mark Wayne. If you like this podcast, rate us on iTunes, or get in touch with us on Twitter at Backroom Whisper, on Facebook at facebook.com/backroomwhispering, or by email backroomwhispering@gmail.com. Tune in again next time.